This show is listener supported. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 4, Episode 16, Nicole. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today, Nicole Chung, author of the memoir, All You Can Ever Know, shares her story with us. We explore the complexities of growing up distinctly different from your adoptive family and how she experienced pregnancy and search and reunion simultaneously. We also discuss grief in adoption as Nicole lost her adoptive father just as she was finishing up her final manuscript for her memoir. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to all of the things we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. But just before we get started, the most exciting news about today's interview: it's not over once this episode ends. You can continue the conversation with Nicole in our pop-up book club, where we will be discussing All You Can Ever Know. And we'll also be doing a live video chat to wrap up book club. So that interview with Nicole and I will be spoiler filled. I can't wait. I will tell you where to find the book club a bit later on in the show. Okay, let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Nicole Chung. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Haley.
I would love it if you would start out by sharing your story with us.
Sure. I was born to Korean immigrants in Seattle in 1981, and I was born very premature. So there were a lot of factors that sort of led to them deciding to place me for adoption, but we know that one of them, my health, was a big factor. They were living in Seattle and working at a family-owned business and working very, very long hours and didn't have health insurance. So while there were a lot of other things, like a lot of other challenges going on in their family, I think that my premature birth and the prognosis from the doctors was sort of one big motivating reason for the placement. So they placed me for adoption in May 1981. I was adopted in July. That's when I went home with my adoptive parents. The adoption was not actually finalized for another 6 months. And I grew up in a small town in Southern Oregon, so it was an interstate adoption. And I lived in the same town for 18 years until I went to college on the East Coast, and I've been out here ever since. I was in my mid-20s when I got pregnant with my first child, and at that point, I had thought about looking for my birth family off and on at several points throughout my life. It wasn't like it just occurred to me when I got pregnant, but I think certainly getting pregnant was kind of the final push that I personally needed to search for them. So I did search for my birth family and reconnected with several of them in 2008. And I have been in reunion ever since.
Can you talk a little bit about your reunion with them and how you reconnected and the relationships that are going on at present?
Sure. I had to go through a confidential intermediary with Washington State Adoptions at the time I was placed. And also because at the time that I searched, I was required to go through a third party. So it was sort of difficult finding one. And I write a little bit about this in the book, but I had talked to a number of intermediaries when I was first researching the process. And it sort of took a while to find one that I felt semi-comfortable with. It's a very delicate thing when you're choosing the person who will get in touch with your birth family for you. And at the time, I think I thought, oh, it's a little bit good that there'll be this extra layer, like a buffer between them and me. And if they don't want to be in contact, or if I decide I'm not comfortable with how things are progressing, there's sort of an easier out. But of course, it was much more complicated than that. And in retrospect, I do think having to go through an intermediary was certainly an expensive and kind of complicated, a really emotional process. But overall, I wouldn't say it was a bad experience. That actual the bureaucratic steps, I think it worked for me at the time. But there were certainly several points at which I really wished I could just kind of reach out directly and skip the middle, the middle person. But anyway, my intermediary did make contact with them after finding out their information, and actually, because for various reasons, my my two sisters were really the first people to get in touch with me by email because we were on opposite sides of the country and I was hugely pregnant. So there was like no question. There was no question of me traveling at that point, because I did most of the search while I was pregnant. And because of the length of time it all took, I mean, literally, I reconnected with them the month I gave birth. The first time I heard from my birth father was the day I went into labor. Like, that's how closely those events were aligned. So at first it was very much just like emails and the occasional phone call or greeting card. And that was really how our relationship started.
And so you found your family and your birth father and your birth mother and two sisters. You have a full sister and a half sister, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you share all of this in your first book, your new memoir coming out, All You Can Never Know. And I had the privilege of reading it, and we'll talk about that more at the very end when we do our recommended resources. But you found out some things about your family of origin when you were in reunion. And just as you said, you're just going through the birth of your first daughter, and you found out some qualities about your family or some of the people in your family that made you question what you yourself were capable of, because you have this new tiny baby and you found out some things. And I won't go into that because I feel like it's a little bit spoilery. But can you talk a little bit about that, about finding your genetic heritage and these personality traits or actions that your first family has, and then wondering about that in yourself? Like, am I going to behave in the same way as my first family did, even though I wasn't raised with them?
I do think that reunion ended up being, of course, far more complicated than I ever imagined it would be. And it's not as though I went into it thinking it would be simple or straightforward. Quite the reverse. I knew it was what I wanted to try to pursue. And at the same time, I think I had a lot of reservations and a lot of like real fears about what I could learn. Because everybody who's adopted, I think, grows up with some kind of, it's almost like family lore. It's like legend. You're told your adoption story so many times. It's not that it's not true necessarily, but it takes on this quality of like a fable. And it's like what sets your life on its path. And when you're small, you don't question. When you get older, maybe you start to ask questions about what you haven't been told or whether you really know the full truth. But it's a risk. Like, primarily, I think what I felt when I was searching for them was, oh, this is the risk I'm taking. Like, I could learn things that really distress me. I could learn like wonderful things, of course. But up until now, I've had this very safe, like prepackaged story. And even when I questioned if it was the whole truth, it was like what I knew. It was comfortable. It was familiar. Knowing that I would be giving all of that up and replacing it with something else, something fundamentally more true, but still different, really did feel like a risk in a big way. And yeah, certainly when you're in reunion, you do learn things. It's never really simple. Like, the work really starts after that. It's not sort of like the final Hallmark movie happy ending that I think people expect it to be. Like, I'm very happy to be in reunion. I consider it like a great blessing and a privilege because I know many adoptees will not have that experience. Many birth families will not have that experience. So I am very grateful every day. But yeah, at the same time, it did really kind of throw my life into upheaval at a time when it was already changing so much with me becoming a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Just figuring out how to deal with both those things together. Yeah. And as you mentioned, sort of wondering, like, what kind of parent will I be? I already obviously knew how I'd been raised. So I already knew the nurture part. And I had my own like doubts about what. I think we all have things, no matter how much we love our parents, where we're like, I am like not going to do that. So, and then when you meet your birth family, you're introducing a whole new set of factors into that, things that you love and admire and are grateful for and you want to emulate and you hope that you and your children have. And then other things where you're like, just not sure how to incorporate like that more complicated legacy into what you already know about yourself. So yeah, becoming a parent is already this like moment of profound discovery and mystery. And in my case, it was like my family was expanding in two ways. So yeah, I think it was just a really overwhelming time. Sometimes I'm still surprised that that's how it all happened. But
well, it's funny for adoptees. So many of us, we have these pivotal life moments that make us search, right? And one of them is becoming a parent.
absolutely.
For a lot of male adoptees, this will just be stereotypically speaking. It's like they're hitting their midlife crisis area, So I don't hear from a lot of male adoptees till they're maybe in their 50s.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. But for a lot of women, it is the first time you're becoming a mother. And for a lot of us, it was right after you've had your child and they're placed in your arms and you have this moment where you're like, oh my gosh, this is the first person I've ever seen that I can remember that's related to me,
Right.
and that's the moment. But you had this whole experience through your pregnancy even. Can you talk about a few of what I'm thinking of is in the book when you're actually meeting your sister Cindy in person and some of those traits that your spouses right away are like, oh my goodness, you guys are so much the same. And so sometimes we found out the not so nice parts of our first family, but also like those beautiful like similarities.
So the main thing that our spouses noticed right away was like the physical similarity. And I think my daughter even noticed it. She was only a year old when I met Cindy. But I remember like she was at this age where she was starting to develop stranger anxiety. She really didn't like new people, and she would like never let them like pick her up or hold her or whatever. But I will always remember how she went like right up to my sister, like she recognized her and like wanted to like play with her and sit in her lap. And I had never seen her behave that way with a stranger before. And I joked it was because like she looked like me, or maybe my husband joked, I can't remember. But like, I mean, I think it was more than that. And yet even if that's all it was this profound like moment of recognition, that my child, who was really just a baby, could like see that in some way she was like me, or we were like each other, and she wasn't scared of her. That was like incredible. So I mean, certainly like there were physical similarities. I mean, when we met, like we look very different, but like, I mean, for example, we wore the same dress size, and like we all of our features are like just close enough where you can tell like we're family. So that was interesting. To this day, like my niece, my sister's daughter, like she's mistaken me for her mom from the back. And it's definitely like, I mean, it happened as recently as like a few months ago, and it's just kind of funny. She came up to me in the room and she started saying mommy, and then she realized it was me. So it was really funny. That sort of thing really does happen, which is a normal everyday thing probably for most sisters. But of course, my sister and I did not experience that until much later in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other traits, I mean, Cindy and I are very different. She has like many good qualities that I lack, like patience. And she's very, very, she's very patient. She's gentle and she's kind and she's extremely strong. I think maybe one of the traits that we do have in common is like stubbornness, which I write about a little bit in the book in very different ways. I'm just kind of out there with it. She's a little quieter about it, but she's probably even more stubborn than I am. So that was just kind of funny to realize that that is definitely a family trait. Those are like the things I think I immediately noticed on that first visit were like definitely the ways in which we were very different, the ways in which I wish I were more like her, but also like a few ways in which we're very similar.
You talk a little bit about how you have always been a writer, even from very young. And this was somewhat puzzling or not necessarily puzzling, but to your adoptive parents, but just like,
Mhm.
oh, this is kind of different. Can you just talk a little bit about your childhood years and, growing up with them and they're white and you're Korean and some of those kind of things. So, we find our families and that we find all these similarities. And then looking back through those lenses, you're like, oh, you kind of see more and more of the differences between yourself and your adoptive family.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always felt kind of out of place in my adoptive family. I mean, never unloved. And it wasn't that I felt like I didn't belong with them either necessarily. Okay, like maybe during a few like moments of adolescent or teenage rebellion. But
Yes.
for the most part, I mean, I felt like I did belong with them. It's more that we were always so different. I noticed this from a really young age. And I don't just mean the physical differences, although those, of course, were very obvious since my family's white, and they were probably among the first things that I noticed. That means that my family, like I was a curious, inquisitive child. I'm sure we talked about adoption before I can remember it. I think they would have had to explain to me like why we look different. And I don't remember that initial conversation. It must have happened when I was very young, like maybe 2.5 or 3. So I don't remember that. I just remember always knowing and always knowing the reason why. So, we were very different in ways that didn't have to do with race. Like I was kind of intense. I think that surprised my parents a little bit. They're much more laid back than I am. I don't know about relaxed. I don't think relaxed is the right word, but just I had kind of a focus and an urge to really push myself, which I actually don't think is unusual. I have met many people like this, but my parents aren't exactly like that. And so I think they were surprised by a lot of things. Part of it was honestly that I was born so prematurely that they didn't really know what my health or they didn't really know what that would be like. So I don't think they were necessarily expecting like I would do very well in school or read or write early, and those things did happen. So like by kindergarten, I was writing these stories and I kind of just kept doing that throughout my childhood. I liked it because I liked writing and I liked creating stories. It was also a little bit of an escape, which I talk about a bit in the book. This is before we talked about self care, but for me, writing growing up was very much about self care and trying to kind of create worlds that made sense to me. Because, as you know, like growing up adopted, sometimes your world or your life, your childhood, your family, as much as you love them, as good as all these things can be for many of us, like sometimes it just doesn't really make sense. And so you spend a lot of time trying to wrestle with that and process it and make sense of your world. And for me, I did that mainly through writing.
And I guess, I don't know, sometimes I think when I was reading your story, sometimes I thought knowing you were born so prematurely and you had these medical issues, you had this extra reason to be like, okay, this is why they gave me up. Like they couldn't afford the medical bills or whatever. Does that ring true for you at all? Or, I mean, so many of us are just like, what was wrong with me that they gave us so up?
Yeah. Oh, I definitely went through so much of that too. Like I remember, this is one of the things I wrote about at the very beginning of the book, and I think it's something many, I don't want to speak for all of us, of course, but I know many adoptees relate to that question of like, why didn't they keep me? And in my case, I had extra reason to ask once I grew up hearing they were married, they were small business owners, and that they had children, like I probably had siblings. So even though that wasn't necessarily confirmed until much later in my life, that was kind of the story I grew up hearing. They had other children. Like, why not keep me? That was a question I remember asking myself a lot. And I didn't really turn out to have a lot of the immediate medical problems that the doctors thought I'd have. So I was lucky, very lucky in that sense. Like neonatal care has come a long way in the last 35 years, right? This was a long time ago, and their options were more limited. And I was very lucky. I weighed 2 pounds at birth, and it was a grim prognosis at first. The other side of it too is that I knew I'd been very lucky, like the premature birth, surviving it, and then thriving, and then not having this long list of issues the doctors told my birth parents and my adoptive parents that I could have made me feel like an extra heap of that. Again, a very common adoptee feeling of you're lucky, you're blessed, you need to be grateful. Things could have been so different. So, in some sense, yes, to answer your question, I did have, I guess, maybe one extra explanation for why the adoption happened. And I could tell myself it wasn't my fault. But there was also this extra pressure to be so grateful that things had worked out the way it had. I grew up hearing it was like a miracle, and like my parents could really actually claim it was some kind of medical, at least, if not miracle, extremely fortunate event that kept me from having these problems, right? So I think I got like an extra helping of that. But yeah, certainly I was told growing up that the main reason they placed me was this issue. And yeah, it also was strange because of course that turned out to not be the case. If they had kept me, they wouldn't have had more medical costs than anybody else raising any child, right? Any sort of typically developing child. So there was also this extra element of, yeah, I could have worked out so differently. I could picture how it would have worked out very differently if they had not been told that I'd have all these problems.
Hmm.
Sorry, that was like a very roundabout way of answering your question, but
No, no, no. No, it's good. It's good. So in the book, you write about this scene where you find out that your biological father says, "Why don't we give the baby to someone who wants her?" After they found out all of these things about your birth and stuff.
mhm.
How does like in reunion, hearing something like that, what goes through your mind?
Oh gosh. It was a strange time in general. And like in a way, it was harder going through it while I was pregnant, really about to give birth pregnant because I was already like really emotional and like really anxious about that, right? But at the same time I did have this distraction and like something else to focus on. And looking back, I really feel that's great because if I had been just going through the reunion and hearing things like this without anything else in my life to focus on, I think it would have become like the sole emotional focus and it would have been really, really challenging because, yeah, to hear things like that, I don't really, this is the thing is I don't really know. One of the harder things about being in reunion was I had expected to find them. And I think I had expected to be told that they did want to keep me, that they really wanted me because that was what I'd grown up hearing. That's what like so many of us grow up hearing. And, even after being in reunion now for 10 years, I can't tell you for sure that they did. They've actually never really told me that. And I've met my birth father a couple of times and we talk, but no, I've never really gotten that from either one of them in terms of I think the way a lot of adoptees like dream about reunion happening. I didn't have that moment where they definitely said we didn't want to do this. I think my birth mother was a lot more hesitant about it than my birth father, but they were kind of a family in crisis for various reasons when I was born. They had a lot of their own problems. And I think the idea of having another child, it's not as simple as maybe they wanted me or they didn't want me. I think they just kind of couldn't. I really believe at that point in their marriage and their lives, they were in such turmoil that for various reasons that maybe it wouldn't have been the best thing for them to keep me. I don't know, it's interesting. One of the other things I learned from my adoption file was just that the social workers could not figure out why this like married couple with children at home were not keeping their child. And, they questioned them. Maybe to their credit, they didn't really figure out what was going on at home or like help them in any real sense, but they did really question whether they were sure about the adoption because from the outside it didn't look like a typical adoption decision to them. And they said over and over, you don't have to do this. Like there are options, there are programs, there's assistance, there are all these things. And my birth parents were really adamant, like no, like we think this is the best thing for her. So that was also like kind of I don't know. It wasn't a bad thing to hear. I was glad that people had really talked through their options with them. I was glad that they'd at least had people kind of arguing the other side so that they knew they did have a choice. That made me feel better than if they hadn't really had any choice. But because of what was going on in their lives, I think they felt they didn't have a choice. Regardless of what social workers said to them, I think they really felt it was kind of their only option.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard. It's, like, emotional, right?
Yeah.
I don't mean to sound so clinical about it, like, but I am truly glad that they had people who talked through that with them.
Mhm.
I think the state did fail my birth family in a lot of ways because, they didn't really inquire or look too closely at what was going on at home, like, why not? I don't know the reasons for that, but, like, certainly if they'd really pressed or looked harder, they could have found out sort of some of the things that were going on and maybe been of some assistance to my birth family. Whether or not my birth family kept me, they could have gotten help when they really needed it. And that didn't happen. But at the same time, of course, I'm glad that like someone did talk to them about their options and I'm glad they did know they had other choices, even if they didn't in the end decide to keep me. At least someone presented it to them as an option.
Mhm. So this is an unusual situation.
It is. It's a really strange.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
yet still, like, present day, there are families who maybe are in a financial crisis and have an unexpected pregnancy and do relinquish, and this happens all over the US. It's really troubling to think that with just some like, not in your situation, I'm talking about these other ones, just, like, some financial help or if they would know they have access to some support services, they would be able to parent, and so for adoptees like yourself who find out, like, they're a younger sibling, like, this is sort of, like, mind-boggling. Like, what do you mean? Anyway, the thing I wonder that if this played a part at all, what do you think, Nicole? The Korean adoption program is, like, widespread, right? There's hundreds of thousands of Korean adoptees, and your parents were already in the United States,
Right.
and, so you're a Korean adoptee, and yet you're not like, we have Korean adoptees all over the US, all over the world, actually. They've been internationally adopted everywhere, and the program is it's so well established, and it's almost normalized.
From a historical standpoint, like Korea was the first big adoption program to the US. Without
Mhm.
Korean adoption, maybe we don't have adoption programs, or at least not such large ones from like so many other countries. Korea sort of set the I don't know, the parameters and did normalize the idea of Americans adopting abroad. So
Yeah, so I guess my question was, like, do you think that played into your biological family's choice to adopt? Like, this was an option,
yeah,
just having that as an option in their minds.
I have no idea. I should ask them. I haven't ever asked them that particular question. I've asked it of myself, like, did they know about adoption as a choice because they, were Korean and therefore this was something that they had seen? I'm not really sure. The other thing is they've been living in the US for several years by the time I was born. So they perhaps they sort of knew about like the American side of it. I don't really know like
Mhm,
what adoption programs they were or weren't familiar with.
mhm,
It's a really good question. I've always felt like a lot of kinship, right, with Korean adoptees for obvious reasons, and by which I mean Korean adoptees from Korea. And yeah, it's interesting because we do have a lot in common, but at the same time, like there are a lot of key differences,
mhm,
and my search and reunion was completely different. I mean, it would have been different if I were from another state. It could have been impossible if I were from another state, as opposed to like if I were a Korean adoptee, like from Korea.
mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I've definitely always felt like I say I'm a Korean adoptee, and it's true. My adoption is not the first thing people would think of when they hear that term. And even today, even people who've like read some of my work, I think they forget and they think I'm from Korea. So like I'll gently correct. Not because I'm unhappy to be mistaken for a Korean born adoptee, just that wasn't my experience. And I try to be careful not to like co opt it either. I don't
Mhm,
feel it's my place to speak to that as much as like a Korean born Korean adoptee.
mhm.
But certainly in terms of issues of like upbringing and race and being in white families and being adopted people of color in a white supremacist society, like we have a lot of similarities, but there are some very key differences. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's a good question. I'm really not sure like what role the Korean adoption program in Korea might have played in my own adoption.
Yeah, and one of the things that, if you're not familiar with this, and talking to my listeners, if you're not familiar with this, I mean, the Korean adoption program was so widespread. There's hundreds of thousands of adoptees all over the world, and they have to go back to Korea to search for their first families. And so it's very difficult. And not just traveling there, just their whole system of how they keep birth records, and it's very complex. And so that's a whole nother layer for Korean adoptees that, Nicole, that you didn't experience. And, yeah, it's and but yet, so there's so many of them, and they have this amazing community built up. And so that is probably what you mean, that you've been connected with a lot of them, and it's amazing how all of those similarities kind of bind us together, right, as adoptees.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've talked to of several adoptees about the Korean adoption program. I can link to those shows in the show notes if you are interested in finding out more about that. I want to just go back to your adoptive parents for a moment.
Sure.
And we haven't really talked about them too much, but you talk a little bit about your reunion with them in the book. So, your reunion with your first family in the book, you talk to your adoptive parents as you're going through this. And I remember this one section where you're talking about your I think your mom asked you about your sisters, and you sort of noted that she didn't feel quite as threatened by a sister relationship.
Definitely. Yeah. So my adoptive parents, well, my dad passed away very recently, but my I still talk about them in the present plural. Like I'm not used to not saying my parents, but my parents were and are have been they've been very supportive of me, particularly regarding like my relationship with my sister Cindy. Cindy and I have become very close. My adoptive parents have met her. She was at my adoptive father's funeral, and so it's just kind of interesting to see like how our families are kind of beginning to blend a little bit more. I mean, 10 years out from reunion, it's not something I would have really envisioned. I think from the very beginning when I was first talking with like Cindy, my adoptive parents were not, they were happy. They were happy for me. They were not really threatened. And maybe threatened is even too strong of a word. But like they didn't feel as anxious about me reconnecting and having a close relationship with a sister versus like a birth parent. They weren't worried about like a sister replacing them in some sense. I grew up an only child in my adoptive family. There were, no siblings already to speak of. And so there wasn't, my parents just kind of didn't have any hesitation or reservations, I guess, about that. So, I mean, that part, it was certainly much easier to talk with them about that aspect of my reunion. And I think they have always been really genuinely happy for me that I have this relationship.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your dad had just passed away. I'm sorry for your loss, and
Thank you.
you were still working on your book when he passed away. And you wrote this beautiful piece about that, how to write a memoir while grieving. And you talk about just as you said that Cindy came to his funeral and about how your families are blending. And there's this one line in here that just sticks out to me so much. You're telling someone that you're going to miss a birthday party because you're going to home for the funeral. And she texts you back. She says, "I'm sorry, Nicole." The other mom texted, "It's so hard to lose a parent, but it will be a comfort to see your father live on in your children."
Mhm.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Just that these assumptions that people have, and they like, being an adopted person, just hearing something like that, what that does.
Yeah, I was surprised. I feel kind of naive for saying this, but I was surprised, like, despite a sort of lifetime of grappling with adoption and like years of writing about it, I did not expect it to be so much on my mind when my father died. I thought I would grieve a parent the way pretty much anybody anywhere would grieve a parent that they loved and were close to. Of course, I know many people are not close to parents for a variety of reasons. And, I want to be sure to acknowledge that. But for me, like, this was a really deep personal loss. I loved my dad for all our differences. He loved me and he was proud of me. And we had, I think, and it was not uncomplicated, but it was like a good relationship. And his health had been declining. So while his death was sudden, it was unexpected in the sense that, I mean, I thought we'd have more time. I'd already kind of started thinking about his mortality and how I would feel. And I knew I would mourn him, and I did. I wasn't expecting to be hit so hard by the adoption. And again, like, it just sounds like kind of naive to say that because of course, it was going to come into my grief in some way. Just hadn't thought about it before. And then, yeah, you do hear comments like that, and people talk about, you'll see like he's going to live on in you. He'll live on in your kids. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, even in adoption, of course, our parents pass things on. We remember their love. If we remember, if we're fortunate enough to have good relationships and good memories, we keep those, and those do live on. But like physically, I'm not going to see my father like in me as I grow older. I won't see him in my children. And my parents have no biological children, so like there is no more like biological link to him. And I had not thought about that, until he died. Like, just the fact that when both my parents are gone, not to be morbid, my mother, knock wood, will live many, many more years. But when they're both gone, like, there isn't, that's it. That's kind of the end of their line. And for me, that's the end of physically seeing them in other people, like in loved ones. That's just kind of it. Of course, grief and death, it's hard for so many other reasons that have nothing to do with like this and nothing to do with adoption. But that was kind of what I was thinking of, particularly when my friend texted that to me, just like, I don't know, like a piece of my dad is gone, he's gone forever. And that I won't see reminders of him in other people that I love. And that's like a hard thing. I like talking about him. It helps bring him back, but it's like still hard figuring out what to say.
Mhm. I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for processing some of that with us because you've experienced it before many of us have, and we don't know what's coming for us. So I think adoptees are so familiar with grief because we have a lifetime of it. Look, when as soon as we well, this is the lingo that we like to use here. As soon as we sort of come out of the fog and understand that losing our first family is a loss, no matter how many times we have been told implicitly or explicitly to be grateful for our new circumstances. It's a loss, and so we go through this grieving process when we come out of the fog, like, oh my goodness, all the things that could have been. And so this is just one more thing. We're gonna have to grieve our adoptive parents when they pass, and then we have a whole extra family if we're in
Yeah.
reunion. That, and then some of my listeners, some of you search and you find a grave, and so then there's
Yeah.
another processing there. So it's a tough thing to be so intimately aware of grief multiple times in our lives, and I think adoptees just get an extra helping of that.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, in one sense, like I don't know. I'm glad I have so many people to miss and so many people to love. And at the same time, yeah, I mean, your life starts with a loss. Like before you gain whatever you gain in adoption, and it can be a great deal if you're lucky. Like before you gain anything, like as an adoptee, you sort of lose everything, and every connection that you were born to have is gone often.
Mhm.
Even for adoptees and open adoptions, I mean, it's just so much more complicated, right? And I don't want to speak, that was not my experience, so I don't want to again like kind of co-opt that, but it is still a loss whether or not you're in contact, whether or not you have answers to some of those questions. And you still grapple with the fact of being sort of, I mean, yeah, being given up. I know that's language not everybody likes, but like sort of literally that is what happened, I guess in my case. I don't kind of shy away from that language. Like I was given up. And whether or not they really wanted to, or whether or not they might have preferred to keep me, like that's something that you grapple with and you grieve as well. Even before you come out of the fog, like as a child, you mentioned before, you ask yourself so many times, what could I have done? Like, or what could they have seen or not seen in me that made this happen? And please know, I want to stress, I don't say that to place blame like on either my birth parents or any other birth parents in difficult circumstances, but just that is a question I have, asked so many times and grew up asking, and I've heard from so many adoptees who've asked the same question. And that too, that form of wondering, those unanswered questions, like those are other like smaller losses. So I think it is really important to acknowledge that and to kind of sit with that and figure out what it means. It's going to mean something very different to every adoptee because every adoption is unique. But yeah, there are definitely some common experiences that we all go through.
Mhm. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about, Nicole, that you really want to say to adoptees in particular before we do our recommended resources?
I mean, this is probably a small spoiler for the book, but in my book acknowledgments, which I'm writing and finalizing now, like one of the groups that I really wanted to thank were adoptees, like adoptees I've met and talked with and learned from and published. It means just so much to me every time. As I mentioned to you before we started, it's such a privilege and an honor to be interviewed by you, like a fellow adoptee. I don't take that for granted. Like I love talking about adoption, and I really love talking about it with adoptees because only adoptees really understand so many of these things intimately. And I think we need each other. I've just learned so much, and people have been so generous with me, and patient with me as I've learned and changed views and grown. So yeah, I mean, this book wouldn't exist without those adoptees, like every single one of them. And that's not an exaggeration, like every single one that I've ever spoken with. It just means a great deal to me. And I am truly grateful. I know we use that word a lot in adoption land and it's fraught, but like in this case, I don't mind saying I am very, very grateful. So that's, that's all I really wanted to say.
Mhm. Yes. Well, thank you. Let's do our recommended resources. So I'm going to start. And of course, I'm going to recommend that people pick up a copy of your memoir, All You Can Ever Know. It is just so beautifully written. I don't know else to say that. It was stunning. I cried. I mean, you take us along on your pregnancy, your search, your reunion, and you just beautifully capture some of these moments that many of us have had. And there's, of course, differences between our stories, but there's so many similar threads. And I just want to read a tiny little quote All at once, I could envision hundreds of gossamer thin threads of history and love, curiosity and memory built up slowly across the time and space between us, a web of connections too delicate to be seen or touched, too strong to be completely severed. So that's just a taste of some of the amazing visuals and descriptions that you have in your book. And I really encourage everyone to grab a copy. It's one of the best books I've read by an adoptee. It's so, so good. Thank you, Nicole. And I've already seen, so we're recording this before your book comes out, but I've already seen some like amazing reviews of it, and not just from the adoption community. Like this is like being very, very well received.
Oh gosh, I first of all, thank you, thank you for recommending it, and it was really nice to hear that little part read. I don't know if I've had my work read to me ever. That's like surreal. So thank you. I'm really honored by your recommendation, and it just means a lot to me. I thought about fellow adoptees every second of writing this. Just, of course, like I do want it to be read beyond the adoption community. I think there are like important things that people should know, not just from my book. Like there's so much that people should know about adoption that's not in my book, but I do want, I would like it to be read and received just by other people because it does. I'd like to complicate that narrative a little bit, the common narratives that people hear, the dominant narratives that people hear about adoption. But at the same time, like when I wrote this, I just kept thinking about other adoptees. Like I thought about young adoptees just starting to kind of question and think about their identities. And I thought about, adoptees who are beginning to search and those in reunion and those who like might never be and who would like to be. I thought, I don't know. If this book gets in the hands of like adoptees and it means something to some of them, I will consider it more than worth it. That is really kind of such a big part of why I wrote it. So thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, what did you want to recommend to us?
So I hope this is not like too self-interested, but I edited and published a great adoption essay series at Catapult, which is the web magazine where I'm currently the editor in chief. And I did it as a guest editor before I even worked for Catapult. I started it then, and I've kind of continued it. I'm always looking for new pieces. The adopted essay series, which I think we can link to
Hmm.
on your resources page, I wrote a short intro, but really every other piece is by a different adoptee. There's 13 pieces now, and I'd love to add to it. I would really love, what I want more than anything is to like edit and publish an anthology of adoptee writing. But in any case, this series will have to do for now. It's beautiful. It's by a diverse group of adoptees, different types of adoption, different international and domestic and kinship. And, it's just, I just love it. I love every single essay in the series. And they tackle these big issues like citizenship for adoptees and reunion and learning your language of origin and just all of these different threads that I think, and they're just, every single one of them is such a beautiful piece. So I'd really like to recommend that, and we will keep adding to it. And then the other book I just wanted to mention, we talked about Korean adoption earlier. There's a book by historian Arissa O, who's a friend of mine, called To Save the Children of Korea: The Cold War Origins of International Adoption. Of course, this is just like one program that she's sort of homing in on as a historian. But as we talked about, like Korean adoption is really the first big intercountry program. And is kind of the reason why we have like so many other intercountry programs today. And so it's just a fascinating, like incredibly well researched, like critical historical look at the origins of not just Korean, but like intercountry adoption in general. People tend to reduce adoption to like just the adoptive parents and the baby, or even just the triad, like the child and the birth parents and the adoptive parents. But, it is very big. It's about like countries and agencies, governments, and it's about issues of, race and culture and identity and capitalism and war. So there are all of these other forces that kind of come into play. And Arissa's book was the first one I read, like a scholarly work, where it kind of put all of that together. It really gives you like the big picture of why this program started and why it grew and why it continues. And I just really, I really appreciated it. Again, she's not an adoptee, but it's just a fantastic book. And yeah, I really recommend it for people who just want to know more about like the background. I feel like when I read it, I already knew a fair bit about Korean adoption, but I learned like just so much And I think that too, the Korean adoptee community has really impacted Arissa's work. So, she does make room for those voices and that perspective. And I've seen like when she talks about adoption, she will center adoptees. And I think it's important because she's working in the academic world. And so, as those conversations start to change in history programs and in social work programs, that I hope we'll start to see sort of a changing and centering of adoptees in the narrative, like, beyond in broader culture.
Absolutely. I mean, that is just what we need, right? As you were saying about your memoir, just shifting the narrative. That's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. And so there's many of us just trying to be heard. And so the more of us that are speaking out about these things, I think that change is coming.
I think it is. I mean, I hope so. I have been really inspired by adoptees who continue to speak out and tell their stories, even when they get pushed back, even when people call us ungrateful or unpatriotic. I mean, I've heard it all, and I know I'm not alone.
Angry
Oh my
is my
goodness.
favorite.
I've gotten just a lot of like very surprising pushback. And and it's not really because I've said anything deeply controversial. I'm really just telling a personal story, but it is somehow sometimes threatening, I think, to people who just have that one narrative about adoption and really like cling to that one narrative. So I don't know. I think adoptees speaking out are very brave and necessary, and it's going to continue kind of disrupting that one narrative that you always hear. And we just need, we need that to happen so that people understand, and that will benefit like so many others in the future. It's good for like people considering adoption in their families. It's good for adoptees. It's good for families of origin to have a more nuanced view of this thing that everybody thinks is so simple. So I'm very glad to be like a very small part of that.
Well said. I agree. Not the small part, the part.
No, it's okay. I mean, I know I'm just one. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Can you tell us, Nicole, where can we find your book and where can we connect with you online?
If you want to link to my Twitter account when you share this, but I'm Nicole_Sujung on Twitter. I have a website, NicoleChung.net, and I do have a bunch of book links up there. So, but you can get it at Amazon. You can order it from your local bookstore, which would be wonderful if you wanted to do that. If they don't have it on the shelves, they can order or pre-order it for you. I'm hoping it'll be in libraries. You can actually ask your library to have it, and that would be great. I would love it to be in school and community libraries. And you can get it on IndieBound and Barnes & Noble, or you can order directly from Catapult, which is my publisher. So there's a lot of options. Oh, I should mention that I'm signing copies for Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon. So you can go to the Powell's website and order a signed copy. It's the same price as like the regular copy. It'll just have my signature. So if you want to do that, the signed pre-orders are available exclusively through Powell's.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that there will be a lot of us reading your book. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today and for your insightful thoughts into what it means to be adopted. I promised I would tell you where you can join the book club. You can click right in your podcast player, wherever you're listening to the show on an app. You can click right on the show art and you'll find the show notes for this episode, and you can request to join the book club right from there. Or you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/adopteesonpodcast, and click the groups tab, and you'll find the book club linked right there. I'll also be sending out a link in our newsletter for the show. So if you want to sign up for that, it's adopteeson.com/newsletter. So please come and join us. It's going to be so much fun talking about her book. And I'm really excited to hear your insights and thoughts about her memoir. I've read it 3 times now, I think, in preparation for book club and in preparation for interviewing Nicole. And like, wow, she's such a gifted author. This episode, as always, is brought to you by my faithful supporters. Thank you. I have people that donate monthly and also just one-time gifts, and both of those are so helpful for covering the production costs of this podcast. If you would like to join them, you can go to adopteeson.com/partner to sign up for Patreon or give a one-time gift. The other way to support the show that is totally free would be just sharing this episode with a friend that you think would be very interested to hear Nicole's story. You will help grow the show, and more adoptees will be able to find support from our community if they are listening to the Adoptees On podcast. So thank you so much for sharing the show, for supporting it, and for giving me the honor of speaking to you in this way every single week. I don't take it lightly or for granted. I promise you that. Thanks for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.